The night I gave my valedictorian speech to an empty auditorium, I made a promise to myself that would change everything. While my parents sat in a beauty pageant audience 3 towns over, cheering for my adopted sister Ashley, I stood alone on that stage and declared my independence from a family that had never truly seen me. 11 years later, when their world came crashing down and they desperately needed the one person they had thrown away, I had become someone they never imagined possible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The auditorium should have been filled with proud families, camera flashes, and the excited chatter of graduation day. Instead, it echoed with the hollow sound of my footsteps as I walked across the stage to accept my diploma and deliver the speech I had worked on for months. Principal Henderson had tried to convince me to postpone it, to wait until more families could attend, but I insisted. Some moments demand to be witnessed, even if the only witness is yourself. I was Emma Martinez then, though that name would soon become as distant as the childhood it represented. 18 years old, valedictorian of Millbrook High's class of 2014, with a full scholarship to Ohio State University for computer science. On paper, I was everything parents should be proud of. In reality, I was the inconvenient reminder of what my parents thought they wanted before they discovered what they actually needed. The adoption happened when I was 8 and Ashley was 6. I remember the day they brought her home from the foster care system. It's all golden curls and bright smiles, the kind of child who could light up a room just by walking into it. My parents had spent months going through the process, attending classes, preparing our house for a new family member. They told me I was going to be a big sister, that I would have someone to play with, someone to share my toys and my room and my life. What they didn't tell me was that they had been quietly disappointed in me for years. I was too serious, too focused on books, too comfortable with silence. I preferred reading in my room to playing outside, chose science projects over sleepovers, and found more joy in solving math problems than in any social activity my parents tried to encourage. They wanted a daughter who would bring life to their quiet house, would fill the spaces with laughter and friends, and the kind of chaos that makes parents feel needed and important. Ashley was everything I wasn't. She was bubbly where I was, reserved, social where I was solitary, charming where I was awkward. Within weeks of her arrival, our house transformed. Suddenly there were playdates and birthday parties, dance classes, and soccer games, a constant stream of activity that revolved around Ashley's magnetic personality. My parents bloomed in this new environment, becoming the kind of engaged, enthusiastic parents they had never quite managed to be with me. The shift was gradual at first, so subtle that I convinced myself I was imagining it. Dinner conversations began to center on Ashley's day at school, her new friends, her latest accomplishments. My academic achievements, once a source of pride, became background noise to the symphony of Ashley's social successes. When I brought home a perfect score on a state math test, my mother smiled absently and asked if I had helped Ashley with her homework. When Ashley made her first friend at school, my parents celebrated with her favorite ice cream and a family movie night. I learned to read the signs, to understand my place in this new family dynamic. I was the responsible one, the one who didn't need attention, the one who could be counted on to take care of herself while my parents navigated the more demanding job of raising their chosen daughter. I became an expert at being invisible, at finding validation in grades and achievements because I couldn't find it at home. The restaurant was another symbol of how completely my family's focus had shifted. Casa Martinez had been my grandfather's dream, passed down to my father with the weight of tradition and expectation. It was a small place on Millbrook's main street, serving authentic Mexican-American dishes that had been in our family for generations. For years, my father had talked about expanding, about turning it into something bigger, something that could support our family for generations to come. When Ashley arrived, those dreams suddenly became urgent. My parents began talking about the restaurant as Ashley's inheritance, about how she would someday take over and bring her natural charisma to the business. They enrolled her in Spanish classes so she could connect with our heritage, something they had never bothered to do with me despite my obvious interest in learning about our family history. They brought her to the restaurant on weekends, teaching her to charm the customers while I stayed home, supposedly to focus on my studies, but really because I didn't fit into their vision of what the family business should become. High school was where the divide became impossible to ignore. While I threw myself into academic competitions, advanced placement courses, and college preparation, Ashley discovered pageants. She was a natural with the kind of effortless beauty and stage presence that made judges take notice. My parents were enchanted, traveling to competitions across the state, turning their weekends into a circuit of hotels and auditoriums and backstage preparation. I told myself it didn't matter. I had my own goals, my own path towards success that didn't require their validation. I was going to study computer science, to build something meaningful with technology, to create solutions for problems that mattered. I spent hours teaching myself programming languages, building simple applications, dreaming of a future where my skills would make a real difference in the world. But even the most independent teenager needs to feel like they matter to someone. And as my senior year progressed, I realized I had been fooling myself about how little their approval meant to me. The moment that shattered my illusions came on what should have been one of the proudest days of my life. Graduation day arrived with the kind of bright Ohio sunshine that makes everything feel possible. I had earned the honor of giving the valedictorian speech, a recognition of 4 years of academic excellence that should have been a celebration for our entire family. I had written and rewritten my speech dozens of times, crafting words that I hoped would make my parents proud, that would finally show them who I really was and what I was capable of achieving. 3 days before graduation, Ashley qualified for the state beauty pageant finals. The competition was scheduled for the same day as my graduation, in a city 3 hours away. When my parents realized the conflict, I watched their faces carefully, looking for any sign of hesitation, any indication that my achievement might factor into their decision. There was none. The conversation lasted exactly 47 seconds. My father explained that this was Ashley's big chance, that state finals only happened once, that my graduation would be recorded and they could watch it later. My mother added that I was smart enough to understand how important this opportunity was for Ashley, that I wouldn't want to be the reason she missed her shot at something so significant. I stood in our kitchen, listening to them plan their weekend around Ashley's pageant, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. It wasn't anger exactly, though. That would come later. It was more like a door closing, the sound of a lock turning, the finality of a decision I didn't know I was capable of making. I told them I understood. I told them to have a great time. At the pageant, I told them I would be fine giving my speech without them there to hear it. I smiled and hugged Ashley and wished her luck, and I meant it because none of this was her fault. She was just a teenager following her dreams, unaware that her success had come at the cost of my sense of belonging in our family. The morning of graduation, I woke up early and got ready with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for special occasions. I put on the dress I had bought with money from my part-time job at the library, styled my hair the way I had, practiced and applied makeup with hands that barely trembled. I looked in the mirror and saw a young woman who was about to speak to her graduating class about the future, about dreams and possibilities and the courage to forge your own path. My parents had left for Ashley's pageant the night before, taking their excitement and energy with them. The house felt hollow, echoing with the absence of celebration that should have filled the air on such an important day. I made myself breakfast, reviewed my speech one final time, and drove to school in the silence of my own thoughts. The auditorium was nearly empty when I walked across the stage. A few families had stayed, mostly parents of students who hadn't earned speaking roles, but who wanted to witness their children graduate. Mrs. Patterson from next door was there, having promised to take pictures for my parents. Some of my teachers sat in the front row, their proud smiles a small comfort in the sea of empty seats. When Principal Henderson called my name, I walked to the podium with my head high and my shoulders straight. I looked out at the sparse audience and felt a strange kind of freedom wash over me. This speech wasn't for my parents anymore. It wasn't for validation or approval or the hope of finally being seen. It was for me and for every student who had ever felt invisible, and for the future I was about to claim on my own terms. I spoke about resilience, and self-determination, about finding your own definition of success and having the courage to pursue it even when others don't understand your vision. I talked about the importance of believing in yourself when no one else believes in you, about turning disappointment into fuel for achievement, about the power of choosing your own family when the one you're born into doesn't know how to love you properly. The applause was genuine, but scattered, echoing strangely in the mostly empty space. As I walked back to my seat, I felt lighter than I had in years, as if I had finally given voice to truths I had been carrying in silence for too long. Mrs. Patterson rushed up afterward with her camera, tears in her eyes as she told me how powerful my words had been, how proud my parents would be when they saw the recording. I thanked her and smiled, but I knew the truth. My parents would watch the recording eventually, probably weeks later when the excitement of Ashley's pageant had faded and they remembered they had another daughter who had achieved something noteworthy. They would tell me it was beautiful, that they were sorry they missed it, that they were proud of me. The moment would have passed. The opportunity for genuine connection lost to their inability to see me as clearly as they saw Ashley. That night, after the graduation party, I had skipped and the family dinner that never happened. I sat in my room and made the decision that would define the next decade of my life. I was going to Ohio State in the fall with a full scholarship and a clear sense of purpose. I was going to study computer science and build something meaningful with my life. And I was going to do it all without the burden of trying to earn love from people who had already decided where to invest their hearts. I didn't announce my decision dramatically or make any grand pronouncements about cutting ties. I simply began the quiet process of separation, of building a life that didn't revolve around seeking approval I would never receive. I got a summer job at a local tech startup, spending my days learning practical programming skills that would serve me. In college, I opened my own bank account and began saving money for expenses my scholarship wouldn't cover. I researched my classes, connected with professors via email, and started building the foundation for a future that belonged entirely to me. When Ashley won second place at the state pageant, I celebrated with genuine happiness for her achievement. When my parents returned home, glowing with pride and full of stories about the competition, I listened with interest and asked appropriate questions. I had learned to love my family from a distance, to appreciate their good qualities without needing their validation to feel worthwhile. As summer progressed and my departure date approached, I began to understand that my parents' favoritism toward Ashley wasn't necessarily malicious. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She simply fit their vision of what they wanted in a daughter more completely than I ever could. They needed someone who would reflect their values, who would carry on their traditions, would make them feel successful as parents in ways that were immediately visible to their community. I couldn't be that person, and more importantly, I no longer wanted to try. I was different from them in fundamental ways that went beyond personality or interests. I was ambitious in directions they couldn't understand, driven by goals that seemed foreign to their experience, motivated by a vision of success that had nothing to do with their definition of a life well lived. The week before I left for college, my mother made one last attempt to bridge the gap that had grown between us. She came to my room while I was packing, sitting on my bed and watching me fold clothes with the kind of careful attention that meant. She had something important to say. She told me she knew things had been difficult, that she understood I felt overlooked sometimes, that she and my father were proud of my accomplishments, even if they didn't always know how to express it. She said that Ashley's needs had seemed more urgent, that they had assumed I was strong enough to handle being independent. While they focused on helping her adjust to our family, I listened without arguing, understanding that this was her way of apologizing without actually acknowledging the depth of what had happened between us. She meant well, and in her own way, she did love me. But love that comes with conditions and comparisons isn't the kind of love that builds strong foundations. And I had already learned to live without it. I thanked her for caring enough to have the conversation, hugged her goodbye, and finished packing for the life I was about to begin. When my parents drove me to campus a few days later, I felt like I was shedding an old skin, leaving behind the version of myself that had spent years trying to fit into a space that was never designed for me. College was a revelation in ways I hadn't expected. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who valued intelligence and ambition, who understood the satisfaction of solving complex problems, who didn't see my quiet intensity as something that needed to be fixed or changed. I threw myself into my studies with the kind of focused determination that had served me well in high school. But now it felt purposeful rather than desperate. I chose to go by Emma Rodriguez, adopting my mother's maiden name as a way of honoring my heritage while creating some distance from the family dynamics that had defined my childhood. It was a small change, but it felt symbolic of the larger transformation I was undergoing, the gradual process of becoming someone who belonged entirely to herself. My professors noticed my talent for programming and encouraged me to pursue internships and research opportunities that would set me apart from my peers. I spent my sophomore year working with a team developing applications for small businesses, discovering that I had an intuitive understanding of how technology could solve real-world problems. By my junior year, I was building my own applications. In my spare time, experimenting with ideas that felt revolutionary, even if they started small. The breakthrough came during my senior year when I developed an inventory management system that could integrate with existing point-of-sale software to provide real-time analytics for small retail businesses. It was elegant in its simplicity, powerful in its applications, and desperately needed by thousands of business owners who couldn't afford enterprise-level solutions. I launched the application as a senior project, pricing it affordably and marketing it through small business networks and local chambers of commerce. Within 6 months, I had over 1,000 active users and inquiries from investors who wanted to help me scale the business. By graduation, I had made my first $100,000 and received offers from tech companies that would have guaranteed me a comfortable career path. Instead, I chose to move to Austin, Texas, where the tech scene was exploding and the opportunities for entrepreneurs seemed limitless. I used my savings and a small business loan to establish Novatech Solutions, focusing on developing software tools that could level the playing field for small and medium-sized businesses competing against larger corporations. The early years were a blur of 18-hour days, failed pitches, sleepless nights spent debugging code, and the constant uncertainty that comes with building something from nothing. I lived in a studio apartment barely larger than my college dorm room, ate ramen noodles more often than I care to remember, measured success in small increments that felt massive at the time. But I was building something that mattered, something that reflected my values and my vision for how technology could be used to empower people rather than replace them. Every client I helped, every problem I solved, every positive review I received felt like validation of the choice I had made to forge my own path rather than follow someone else's expectations. The company grew slowly but steadily, earning a reputation for innovative solutions and exceptional customer service. I hired carefully, looking for people who shared my commitment to using technology as a force for good, who understood that our success would be measured not just in profits, but in the positive impact we had on our clients' lives. By my 5th year in business, Novatech Solutions had grown to employ 23 people and served over 10,000 clients across the country. We had developed a suite of business tools that integrated seamlessly with existing systems, providing insights and automation that allowed small business owners to compete effectively in an increasingly digital marketplace. The recognition came gradually, then all at once. Industry publications began featuring our innovations. Business conferences invited me to speak about entrepreneurship and technology. Investors started approaching me with offers that would have made me wealthy beyond my childhood dreams. When Texas Business Monthly named me Entrepreneur of the Year, I felt like I had finally become the person I was always meant to be. Standing on that stage at the Austin Convention Center, accepting an award that represented years of work and sacrifice, an unwavering belief in my own vision, I thought about the empty auditorium where I had given my valedictorian speech. The contrast was so stark it almost made me laugh. This time the audience was filled with successful business leaders, tech innovators, and media representatives who understood exactly what I had accomplished and why it mattered. I had built a life that belonged entirely to me, surrounded by people who valued my contributions and shared my goals, free from the need to prove myself to anyone who couldn't see my worth. I had achieved the kind of success that couldn't be diminished by comparison or conditional approval. Success that existed independently of anyone else's opinion about who I should be or what I should want. For 11 years, I had maintained minimal contact with my family, sent Christmas cards and birthday greetings, polite messages that acknowledged our connection without inviting deeper engagement. I knew the basic facts about their lives through social media and occasional updates from Mrs. Patterson, who still lived next door to my childhood home and seemed to consider herself a bridge between my old life and my new one. Ashley had married, young, to a man who promised her the world and delivered disappointment instead. The restaurant was struggling, buffeted by economic changes and competition from chain establishments that could undercut my father's prices while offering the convenience of familiar brands. My parents were aging, dealing with health issues and financial stress that made every day feel like a struggle against forces beyond their control. I felt sympathy for their difficulties, the way you might feel sorry for characters in a story you read about in the newspaper. Their problems were real and painful, but they felt distant from my daily reality, disconnected from the life I had built and the future I was creating. I had learned to care about them without feeling responsible for them, to wish them well without needing to fix their problems. That carefully maintained distance was about to be shattered by a phone call that would force me to confront everything I thought I had left behind. Everything I believed about family and forgiveness, and the price of belonging to something larger than yourself. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing quarterly reports in my corner office on the 15th floor of Austin's Glass Tower building. The view from my desk stretched across the city's skyline, a testament to how far I had traveled. From the small-town girl who once sat in empty auditoriums, my assistant Marcus had screened the call 3 times before finally putting it through, his voice tight with confusion when he announced that Emma Martinez was on line 2, claiming to be my mother. I stared at the blinking light on my phone for a full 30 seconds before picking up. 11 years of silence had built a wall between us that felt impenetrable. But the sound of her voice saying my name cracked something deep inside my chest that I thought had healed completely. She was crying before she finished saying hello, not the careful, manipulative tears I remembered from my childhood when she wanted something from my father, but the raw, desperate sobbing of someone whose world was collapsing in real time. Between gasps, she managed to tell me that everything was falling apart, that they needed help, that she didn't know where else to turn. The restaurant was 3 months behind on rent. My father's diabetes had progressed to the point where he required daily insulin injections and regular dialysis treatments that their insurance barely covered. Ashley's marriage had imploded spectacularly when her husband clinked out their joint accounts and disappeared with his secretary, leaving her with a 7-year-old daughter and mountains of debt that carried both their names. But the real crisis, the emergency that had driven my mother to break 11 years of silence, was Ashley's daughter, Sophia, my niece, a child I had never met, but whose existence I knew about through the careful distance of social media updates and Mrs. Patterson's well-meaning reports. Sophia had been diagnosed with a rare autoimmune condition that was attacking her nervous system, causing seizures and progressive muscle weakness that threatened to leave her permanently disabled. The experimental treatment that could save her was available at a research hospital in Houston, but it cost $300,000 and wasn't covered by any insurance plan. The family had exhausted their savings, mortgaged the house, sold everything of value they owned, still fallen short by more than half the required amount. They had 60 days to raise the money or lose their spot in the clinical trial, which might not be offered again for years. As my mother talked, painting a picture of desperation so complete it felt like drowning, I found myself calculating solutions with the same analytical mind that had built my business empire. $300,000 was significant, but not impossible for someone with my resources. A few phone calls to the medical technology investors I knew could potentially secure a spot in the trial, regardless of their ability to pay. The connections I had built in Austin's tech community included several people who sat on hospital boards and research foundations. I could solve this problem with a morning's work and a few strategic conversations. The money was real, but manageable. The connections were already in place. The outcome would save a child's life while relieving the suffering of people who had once meant everything to me. It should have been an easy decision, the kind of straightforward problem-solving that made my professional life so satisfying. Instead, I felt paralyzed by the complexity of emotions that my mother's call had unleashed. This wasn't just about money or medical connections or even saving a child's life. This was about whether Emma Rodriguez, successful entrepreneur and self-made woman, was willing to let Emma Martinez, the overlooked daughter who had spent her childhood seeking scraps of approval, make decisions that could unravel everything I had built for myself. I told my mother I needed time to think, that I would call her back within 24 hours with an answer. The lie came easily because the truth was too complicated to explain over the phone. I didn't need time to figure out the logistics of helping Sophia. I needed time to decide whether I was strong enough to risk opening the door I had spent 11 years keeping locked. After hanging up, I sat in my office for 2 hours without moving, staring at the Austin skyline while my mind churned through memories I had worked hard to file away. The successful businesswoman who had been reviewing quarterly reports an hour earlier felt suddenly fragile, vulnerable to old wounds that professional success couldn't heal. I thought about Sophia, a 7-year-old girl I had never met who was fighting a battle that could define the rest of her life. She was innocent in all of this, a casualty of adult choices and family dynamics that existed long before her birth. Whatever resentment I carried toward my parents, whatever complicated feelings I had about Ashley, none of it was Sophia's fault. But I also thought about the price of re-engagement, the cost of allowing my family back into my carefully constructed life. For 11 years, I had been free from the exhausting cycle of seeking approval and finding disappointment. Free from the constant comparison to Ashley that had defined my childhood. Free from the role of responsible daughter who was expected to solve problems that others had created. Success had given me the luxury of choosing my own family, surrounding myself with people who valued my contributions and supported my goals without reservation. My business partner Diana had become the mentor I had always needed, offering guidance and encouragement that was never conditional on being someone other than who I was. My team at Novatech felt more like family than the people who shared my DNA, united by common purpose and mutual respect that didn't depend on blood relations or childhood history. Opening the door to my biological family meant risking all of that, potentially compromising the peace I had found by inviting chaos back into my world, even if I could help Sophia without fully reconciling with my parents. Even if I maintained boundaries and kept the interaction limited to this specific crisis, I knew that solving their problem would establish me as their emergency contact for future disasters. My mother's call had made it clear that they saw me as their salvation. The successful daughter who could swoop in with resources and connections to fix what they couldn't handle themselves. They weren't reaching out because they missed me or because they had realized the mistakes they made during my childhood. They were calling because they needed something only I could provide, and that transaction felt uncomfortably familiar. The space was a monument to my success and my solitude. All clean lines and expensive furnishings that reflected my taste without accommodating anyone else's preferences. I had designed it as a sanctuary from the demands of business and social obligations, a place where I could exist entirely as myself without performing for anyone else's benefit. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I opened a bottle of wine, sat on my balcony overlooking the city lights, and called Diana. She had been my first manager when I moved to Austin, taking a chance on a young programmer with big ideas and limited experience. Over the years, she had become my business partner, my mentor, and the closest thing I had to family in my new life. Diana listened without interrupting as I explained the situation, the family crisis that had erupted into my carefully ordered world. The impossible choice between helping a sick child and protecting my own emotional well-being. She had heard pieces of my family history over the years, enough to understand why their sudden reappearance in my life felt like a threat rather than an opportunity. When I finished talking, Diana was quiet for a long moment before asking the question I had been avoiding. She wanted to know what I would do if Sophia wasn't my niece. If she was just a child in need, whose family had somehow learned about my resources and connections. Would I help a stranger's daughter get life-saving treatment if I had the power to make it happen? The answer was obvious and immediate. Of course I would help. I had built my business around the principle of using technology to level playing fields and solve problems that seemed insurmountable to people with limited resources. Helping families access medical care that could save their children was exactly the kind of meaningful impact I had always wanted my success to enable. Diana's question reframed the entire situation, stripping away the emotional complexity of family dynamics and focusing on the core issue: a child needed help that I could provide. Everything else was secondary noise that I was allowing to cloud my judgment about what was fundamentally a simple moral choice. But even as I acknowledged the logic of Diana's perspective, I knew that the situation was more complicated than helping a stranger would be. My family's crisis wasn't just about Sophia's medical needs. It was about my parents' financial irresponsibility, Ashley's poor choices in partners, and decades of family dysfunction that had created this emergency. Helping them now meant not just saving Sophia, but potentially enabling the same patterns of behavior that had led to this crisis in the first place. I spent the night researching Sophia's condition, learning everything I could about the experimental treatment and the research hospital in Houston where it was being offered. The therapy was genuinely promising, with early trial results showing significant improvement in patients with similar autoimmune conditions. The cost was high because it involved personalized treatment protocols and cutting-edge technology that wasn't yet available through standard medical channels. More importantly, I discovered that the clinical trial had limited spots and strict deadlines because the research was being funded by grants that operated on specific timelines. Missing this opportunity really could mean waiting years for another. Chance in Sophia's condition was progressive enough that waiting wasn't a viable option. By morning, I had made my decision. I was going to help Sophia get the treatment she needed, but I was going to do it on my terms, in a way that protected both my interests and my peace of mind. This wasn't going to be a family reunion or an opportunity for reconciliation. It was going to be a business transaction, executed with the same professional boundaries I used in all my other dealings. I called my mother back exactly 24 hours after her initial call. Reaching her at the restaurant during the lunch rush when I knew she would be distracted and less likely to turn our conversation into an emotional marathon, I told her I would arrange for Sophia's treatment and cover all associated costs, but that I had specific conditions that were non-negotiable. First, all communication about Sophia's care would go through me directly. I would coordinate with the medical team, handle insurance negotiations, and manage the logistics of getting Sophia enrolled in the clinical trial. My parents and Ashley could be involved in medical decisions, but I would be the primary contact for all administrative and financial matters. Second, this assistance was specifically limited to Sophia's medical emergency. I was not providing ongoing financial support for the restaurant, my father's medical bills, or Ashley's debt problems. Those issues predated Sophia's diagnosis and were separate from the immediate crisis we were addressing. Third, once Sophia's treatment was complete and her condition stabilized, I expected our interaction to return to the minimal contact we had maintained for the past 11 years. This was not an opening for regular family involvement in my life that would not be available for future financial emergencies or family crises. My mother tried to argue to negotiate terms that would give them more access to my resources and my life. She talked about family obligations and the importance of forgiveness. It's about how Sophia deserved to know her aunt and how I was missing out on the joy of being part of a family again. I listened without engaging in the emotional manipulation, responding only to practical questions about timeline and logistics. When she realized I wasn't going to be swayed by appeals to sentiment or guilt, she accepted my conditions with the grateful desperation of someone who didn't have better options. Within 48 hours, I had spoken directly with the research team in Houston, secured Sophia's spot in the clinical trial, and arranged for all treatment costs to be paid through a medical trust fund that protected my privacy while ensuring the hospital received payment. I also connected Ashley with a social worker who specialized in helping families navigate complex medical situations, providing support that would extend beyond the immediate crisis. The efficiency with which I solved their problem felt both satisfying and somewhat hollow. I had used my resources and connections to save a child's life, which should have been purely rewarding. but the ease with which I had cut through bureaucracy and financial barriers also highlighted how different my world had become from theirs, how much power I now wielded compared to their helplessness. I didn't attend Sophia's first treatment appointment, though. I monitored her progress through regular reports from the medical team. The early results were encouraging, with Sophia responding well to the therapy and showing measurable improvement in her symptoms. Her seizures decreased in frequency and intensity, and the muscle weakness that had been progressing rapidly began to stabilize. 3 weeks into Sophia's treatment, Ashley called me directly for the first time in over a decade. Her voice was shaky with emotion as she tried to express gratitude that felt too large for words. She told me about watching Sophia play with toys in the hospital playroom, about seeing her daughter smile without the shadow of pain that had become constant before the treatment began. Ashley also tried to apologize for our childhood, for the favoritism that had driven me away, for not understanding how my parents' choices had affected me. Her words were sincere, but felt strange, like an apology for someone else's crimes, delivered by another victim of the same system. I accepted her thanks graciously, but kept the conversation focused on Sophia's progress rather than our shared history. There was no point in relitigating the past. When our present interaction was working well within the boundaries I had established, Ashley seemed to understand this, perhaps recognizing that pushing for more emotional connection might jeopardize the help her daughter was receiving. As Sophia's treatment continued and her condition improved, I began to feel a sense of closure that I hadn't expected. Not the reunion and reconciliation that my family might have hoped for, but something more valuable to me. I had proven to myself that I could help them without losing myself, that my success could serve a purpose larger than my own satisfaction without requiring me to sacrifice the independence I had fought so hard to achieve. The experimental treatment lasted 3 months, with Sophia receiving weekly infusions and daily medications that gradually reset her immune system's response to her own nervous tissue. By the end of the trial period, her seizures had stopped completely, and the muscle weakness that had threatened to confine her to a wheelchair was reversing itself week by week. When the medical team declared the treatment successful and Sophia's condition stable, I felt a satisfaction that was different from any business achievement I had experienced. This success couldn't be measured in profits or market share or industry recognition. It was measured in a 7-year-old girl's ability to run and play and dream about a future that extended beyond the hospital room, where she had spent so many frightening weeks. My mother called to tell me that Sophia was asking about the aunt who had helped her get better, wondering when she might meet the person who had made her recovery possible. The request was innocent and sweet, but it represented exactly the kind of emotional complication I had been trying to avoid. I explained to my mother that Sophia was welcome to write me letters or send drawings if she wanted to express her thanks, but that personal meetings weren't part of our arrangement. I wasn't ready to become a regular presence in Sophia's life, partly because I didn't trust myself to maintain appropriate boundaries with a child who represented everything good about my family without any of the complicated history that made adult relationships so difficult. The truth was that Sophia's recovery had affected me more deeply than I wanted to admit. Knowing that my success had directly contributed to saving her life gave my achievements a meaning that pure professional accomplishment couldn't match. But it also reminded me of what I had given up by cutting ties with my family, the relationships and connections that might have enriched my life if they hadn't come with so much emotional baggage. For the first time in years, I found myself wondering what my life might look like if I could find a way to maintain some connection with my family without sacrificing the independence and peace I had worked so hard to achieve. Sophia's illness had shown me that my family's problems weren't always self-created disasters that I should avoid. Sometimes they faced genuine crises that required resources and connections I possessed. Situations where my help could make a meaningful difference without enabling destructive patterns. But I also recognized that Sophia's case was unique because she was an innocent victim of circumstances beyond her control. My parents' financial struggles and Ashley's relationship disasters were different types of problems rooted in choices and patterns that predated my success and would likely continue regardless of how much help I provided. As Sophia completed her treatment and returned to a normal childhood routine, settled back into my own life with a sense of accomplishment tempered by new questions about the role I wanted my family to play in my future. I had successfully helped them through their crisis while maintaining my boundaries. But the experience had revealed possibilities I hadn't considered and emotions I thought I had resolved. The thank you package arrived on a Friday afternoon, delivered to my office by a courier service that had been instructed to wait for a signature. Inside the carefully wrapped box was a collection of drawings Sophia had made during her recovery. Colorful pictures of doctors in hospitals and families holding hands under bright yellow suns. At the bottom of the pile was a photograph of Sophia, playing in a park, running toward the camera with the kind of uninhibited joy that only children can express completely. On the back, Ashley had written a simple message in careful handwriting. "Thank you for giving her the chance to run again. We will never forget what you did for us." I stared at that photograph for a long time, seeing in Sophia's smile the best possible outcome of the choice I had made. Whatever complicated feelings I had about my family's return to my life, whatever questions remained about future interactions and boundaries, this moment of pure joy justified everything I had risked. By opening the door I had kept closed for so long. But as I filed the photograph in my desk drawer next to other mementos of achievements I was proud of, I knew that Sophia's recovery was just the beginning of a larger conversation about who I wanted to be and what kind of life I wanted to build. Going forward, successful entrepreneur who had solved their crisis efficiently and professionally was the same person as the lonely daughter who had given her valedictorian speech to an empty auditorium. Both versions of myself had played a role in saving Sophia's life, and both would influence whatever decisions I made about my family's place in my future. 6 months after Sophia's recovery, I thought I had successfully compartmentalized my family's crisis into a closed chapter of charitable work. The medical bills were paid, Sophia was thriving in 2nd grade, and my life had returned to its familiar rhythm of board meetings, product launches, and strategic planning sessions. I had proven to myself that I could help without becoming entangled. That success could serve a greater purpose without compromising my carefully constructed independence. Then Marcus knocked on my office door with an expression I had learned to recognize as trouble. In his hands was a thick manila envelope, marked with the return address of Hendricks. Morrison and Associates, a law firm I didn't recognize from Millbrook, Ohio. The certified mail receipt required my personal signature, and the weight of the envelope suggested documents far more substantial than the thank you cards and occasional updates I'd been receiving from my family. Inside were legal papers that made my stomach drop with their implications. Casa Martinez was facing immediate foreclosure proceedings, with the bank demanding full payment of outstanding loans within 30 days or seizure of all assets, including the building, equipment, and family home that my grandfather had used as collateral decades earlier. The restaurant that had been my family's source of income and identity for 3 generations was about to disappear, taking with it not just my parents' livelihood but the physical space that held most of their memories and all of their remaining hope. But the legal documents revealed a problem far more complex than simple financial mismanagement. The crisis had been triggered by Ashley's ex-husband, Marcus Dubois, who had apparently forged my father's signature on a series of business loans that he used to fund his own failed ventures. When those investments collapsed and Marcus disappeared, the banks came after the Martinez family assets that had been used as collateral for loans my parents never knew existed. The fraud was elaborate and sophisticated, involving fake documents, stolen identity information, a network of shell companies that had hidden the true nature of the transactions until it was too late to reverse them. Marcus had exploited my father's trust and limited understanding of complex financial instruments, convincing him to sign papers that Bob believed were routine business documents but were actually personal guarantees for millions of dollars in debt. My parents had discovered the fraud only when the banks began foreclosure proceedings, at which point the statute of limitations had expired for criminal charges and the civil courts offered little recourse for elderly victims of financial crimes. The lawyers they consulted explained that proving fraud would require years of litigation and hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees. With no guarantee of recovering their losses even if they won, the envelope also contained a handwritten letter from my father, his shaky penmanship filling 3 pages with words that felt like they were carved from his heart. He explained that he wasn't asking me to save the restaurant or pay off the fraudulent debts. He knew that the business was lost, that the building where his father had served his first customers would soon belong to strangers who would tear it down for something more profitable. What he wanted was the chance to tell me the truth about why he and my mother had made the choices that drove me away. He wanted to explain the fear that had motivated their favoritism toward Ashley, the mistakes they had made in trying to protect her from the trauma of her early childhood, and the way their focus on her needs had blinded them to the damage they were causing to their relationship with me. Ashley had been removed from her birth parents at age 4 after neighbors reported severe neglect and suspected abuse. She had spent 2 years in foster care, cycling through homes where she learned to charm adults as a survival mechanism, to be whatever version of herself would earn her safety and stability. When my parents adopted her, they believed they were rescuing a damaged child who needed extra love and attention to heal from her traumatic beginning. What they hadn't understood was that their attempts to compensate for Ashley's early trauma had created a different kind of damage for me. In their desperation to prove to Ashley that she was loved and wanted, they had inadvertently taught me that love was conditional, that affection was a limited resource that had to be earned through compliance and performance. My father's letter was both an apology and a confession, acknowledging years of choices that had prioritized Ashley's emotional needs over mine without considering the long-term consequences for our family dynamics. He wrote about the graduations and achievements they had minimized, the conversations they had avoided, the daughter they had taken for granted because I seemed strong enough to handle their neglect. But the letter also revealed something I had never known about my own adoption story. I wasn't adopted like Ashley, but I had been planned and wanted in a way that made my parents' subsequent favoritism toward her even more painful to understand. My mother had struggled with infertility for years before conceiving me, and my birth had been the fulfillment of dreams they had almost given up on. When they decided to adopt Ashley, it wasn't because they needed another child to complete their family. It was because they wanted to give me a sibling, and because they believed they had so much love to offer that they could easily expand their family to include a child who desperately needed what they had to give. Their intentions had been generous and well-meaning, but their execution had been disastrous for everyone involved. The letter ended with a request that caught me completely off guard. My father wasn't asking for money or legal help or intervention with the bank. He was asking if I would consider coming home for one conversation. One opportunity to sit in the same room and have the honest discussion they should have initiated years earlier. He wanted to tell me about the pride he had felt watching me succeed, the regret he carried about missing so many important moments in my life, and the way my achievements had forced him to confront his own failures as a parent. He wanted to explain that losing the restaurant felt like justice for the way he had failed to protect both his daughters from the consequences of his choices. Most surprisingly, he wanted to ask for my forgiveness, not so he could feel better about his mistakes, but so I could be free from whatever anger or resentment I might still carry toward him. He had learned through therapy sessions mandated by the fraud investigation that forgiveness was something I could choose for my own benefit, regardless of whether he deserved it or earned it through changed behavior. I read the letter 3 times before setting it aside, my hands trembling with emotions I couldn't immediately identify. The revelation about Ashley's background recontextualized everything I had understood about my childhood, explaining patterns of behavior that had seemed like simple favoritism, but were actually desperate attempts to heal trauma that predated my birth. Understanding their motivations didn't excuse the damage they had caused, but it made their choices feel less like personal rejection and more like misguided attempts to solve problems they didn't fully understand what they'd been trying to save Ashley from her past, without recognizing that their methods were creating a different kind of wound in their other daughter. The legal documents painted a picture of my parents as victims of sophisticated fraud, elderly people who had been targeted by a predator who understood their vulnerabilities and exploited their trust for personal gain. The image of my father as a man who had chosen Ashley over me was complicated by the reality of a 70-year-old man who had been manipulated by someone he trusted, someone who had married into his family and then systematically stolen everything he had worked to build. I spent the afternoon researching Marcus Dubois, using the same investigative resources I had employed to monitor my family's situation during Sophia's treatment. What I found was a pattern of financial predation that stretched back years, involving multiple elderly victims who had been targeted through their adult children's relationships. Marcus had apparently met Ashley through an online dating service that specialized in connecting people with specific financial profiles. He had courted her with expensive gifts and romantic gestures funded by credit cards and loans that he had no intention of repaying. The wedding my parents had celebrated as Ashley's chance for happiness had been the culmination of a carefully orchestrated scam designed to gain access to the Martinez family assets. The sophistication of the fraud was impressive in its cruelty. Marcus had spent months studying my family's financial situation, learning about the restaurant's operations, my father's business relationships, and the legal documents that tied the family's assets together. He had targeted my father's limited English skills and unfamiliarity with complex financial instruments, presenting loan documents in ways that obscured their true nature and consequences. Most disturbing was the evidence that Marcus had researched me as well, apparently calculating that my estrangement from my family made me an unlikely source of financial rescue if his schemes were discovered. He had counted on my absence from their lives as protection against the kind of legal and financial resources that might have exposed his fraud before it was too late to prevent. The investigation revealed that Ashley had been as much a victim as my parents, manipulated by someone who had studied her psychological vulnerabilities and exploited her need for security and affection. The marriage had been a performance designed to gain access to the Martinez family assets, with Ashley serving as an unwitting accomplice in her own family's destruction. Learning about Marcus's manipulation tactics made me feel something I hadn't expected toward Ashley: genuine sympathy. She had been targeted by someone who understood her childhood trauma and used it against her. Someone who had promised her the stability and love she'd always craved, while systematically destroying the family that had tried to provide those things. The parallel between Ashley's victimization and my own childhood experience of feeling manipulated by family dynamics was uncomfortably clear. We had both been shaped by forces beyond our control, both struggled with the consequences of adults, making choices that served their own needs rather than protecting the children in their care. But while I had responded to family dysfunction by creating distance and independence, Ashley had responded by seeking security through relationships that promised to fill the emotional voids left by her early trauma. Neither strategy had been wrong, but both had left us vulnerable to different types of harm. The realization that my family's current crisis was the result of external predation rather than internal dysfunction changed my emotional response to their situation completely. This wasn't about enabling bad choices or rewarding irresponsible behavior. This was about helping elderly victims of financial crimes recover from betrayal that had been designed to exploit their vulnerabilities. I called Diana that evening, needing to talk through the implications of what I had learned with someone who understood both my family history and my current situation. She listened as I explained the legal documents, the letter from my father, and the investigation results that had revealed the true nature of Marcus's relationship with Ashley. Diana's response was characteristically direct and practical. She pointed out that my father's request for a conversation was separate from the legal and financial crisis facing the family. I could choose to have that discussion regardless of whether I decided to help with the foreclosure proceedings. I could offer financial assistance without committing to ongoing family involvement. But she also observed that the fraud investigation had revealed information that might change how I understood my own childhood and the choices that had led to my estrangement from my family. The favoritism that had felt like personal rejection might have been misguided attempts to address trauma that I hadn't known existed. Diana suggested that I might benefit from having the conversation my father had requested, not because I owed him forgiveness or reconciliation, but because understanding their motivations might help me make better decisions about how much of my current life I wanted to share with them going forward. She also reminded me that my response to this crisis would be observed by Sophia, who was old enough to understand that her family was in trouble and to notice whether the aunt who had saved her life would help them again when they needed it. Whatever I decided about my relationship with my parents, I had already established a connection with Sophia that came with its own responsibilities and opportunities. The conversation with Diana clarified something that had been bothering me. Since I received the legal documents, my reluctance to help with the foreclosure wasn't just about protecting myself from family manipulation. It was about the fear that solving this crisis would establish me as their permanent safety net, the successful daughter who would always be available to fix problems that others had created. But the fraud investigation had revealed that this crisis was genuinely beyond their control, caused by criminal behavior that had been designed to exploit their vulnerabilities. Helping them recover from Marcus's predation wouldn't be enabling destructive patterns. It would be preventing elderly victims from losing everything to a sophisticated scam. I spent the weekend reviewing my finances and consulting with my attorneys about the legal options available to help my family recover from the fraud. The foreclosure could be prevented with a cash payment that would satisfy the bank's immediate demands. But the larger legal battle to recover the fraudulent losses would require years of litigation and substantial legal fees. My lawyers explained that cases involving financial fraud against elderly victims often resulted in settlements that recovered only a fraction of the losses, even when the fraud could be clearly proven. The criminals typically spent or hid their gains in ways that made asset recovery nearly impossible, leaving their victims with legal victories that provided little practical relief. The most effective approach would be to pay off the immediate debts to prevent foreclosure, then pursue the fraud case as a matter of principle rather than financial recovery. The legal action might not recover the stolen money, but it could prevent Marcus from targeting other families and potentially result in criminal charges that would provide some measure of justice. I also discovered that my intervention in the case could significantly improve the legal outcomes for my family. Our resources would allow them to hire the kind of experienced attorneys who specialized in financial fraud cases. Investigators who could trace hidden assets, expert witnesses who could testify about the sophisticated nature of the scam. More importantly, my success in the business world would make me a credible witness if the case went to trial. My testimony about my family's character and Marcus's manipulation tactics would carry weight with juries who might otherwise be skeptical of elderly victims' claims about being deceived by sophisticated fraudsters. By Sunday evening, I had made my decision. It's going to help my family recover from the fraud. But I was also going to accept my father's invitation for a conversation about our relationship and the choices that had shaped our family dynamics. Both actions felt necessary for different reasons, and both carried risks that I was finally ready to accept. The legal intervention would be handled through my attorneys, maintaining the professional boundaries that had worked well during Sophia's medical crisis. I would pay off the immediate debts to prevent foreclosure, fund the fraud investigation and recovery efforts, and provide ongoing legal support until the case was resolved. The personal conversation with my father would be separate from the financial assistance, an opportunity to address questions and emotions that had been unresolved for over a decade. I wasn't promising forgiveness or reconciliation, but I was willing to listen to explanations that might help me understand choices that seemed incomprehensible when I was younger. I called my mother on Monday morning, reaching her at the restaurant during the quiet period between breakfast and lunch service. Her voice was thick with exhaustion and stress, but it brightened considerably when she realized I was calling with news about the legal documents. I explained that I would be hiring attorneys to handle the fraud case and paying off the debts necessary to prevent foreclosure. I would also be funding a comprehensive investigation into Marcus's criminal activities with the goal of recovering as much of the stolen money as possible and preventing him from targeting other families. My mother's response was immediate and overwhelming gratitude. Tears and promises and assurances that they would find ways to repay me for the help I was providing. I stopped her before she could make commitments that would only add pressure to an already difficult situation. I explained that this assistance was my response to criminal behavior that had targeted my family, not a loan that required repayment or a gift that created ongoing obligations. I was helping them recover from fraud the same way I would help any elderly victims of financial crimes, because it was the right thing to do and because I had the resources to make a meaningful difference. But I also told her that I was interested in having the conversation my father had requested. The honest discussion about our family history and the choices that had led to my estrangement from them. I wanted to understand their perspective on events that had shaped my childhood, and I wanted to share my own experience of feeling overlooked and undervalued during those years. My mother's response to this possibility was even more emotional than her reaction to the financial assistance. She talked about years of regret, about conversations she had wanted to have but hadn't known how to initiate, about the pride she felt in my achievements and the sadness she carried about not being part of my success. With a mixture of sympathy and caution, understanding that her emotions were genuine, but also recognizing that this conversation would need to happen on my terms and in my timeline. I wasn't ready to rebuild a relationship that had been damaged by years of neglect and misunderstanding, but I was willing to explore whether some form of limited connection might be possible. We scheduled the conversation for the following weekend, when I would fly to Ohio to meet with my father at the restaurant during closed hours. The familiar setting would provide context for the discussion while avoiding the emotional complexity of turning to my childhood home, which was also facing foreclosure as part of Marcus's fraud scheme. As I prepared for the trip, I found myself thinking about Sophia and the role she had played in opening the door to this possibility. Her innocent request to meet the aunt who had helped her get better had reminded me that family relationships could be sources of joy and connection, not just obligation and disappointment. I wasn't sure what kind of relationship I wanted with my family going forward, but I was finally ready to have the conversation that might help me figure that out. The successful entrepreneur who had built a life entirely on her own terms was about to meet the parents who had shaped her in ways she was only beginning to understand. Tai. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.